Jordan, you're blue.
Guys, don't drink the water.
Yes.
Oof, still so blue.
It's better.
I have an orange background to really
Yeah,
offset my
it's-
blueberry tone.
It's very colorful. It's very nice.
Got some color tonight. Kristen, can you still hear me through these headphones?
What's that?
Can you
Yeah, I
hear
can
me
hear
through
you.
these headphones?
Yep. Hi, Elizabeth.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Hey, Mark, long time.
Who was that?
Darby, good to see you.
Nice to see. It's nice to be seen.
Alexa, stop.
Madam Mayor, Councillor Greider is on her way back from work site, and she might be a couple of minutes delayed, but she said she will be here.
Thank you. I am trying to find my agenda real quick. I know it's here because I looked at it earlier. Okay, looks like we're getting quite a crew going. Anybody watch skating last night? Martin Chen sweep the ice. It was so beautiful. If you haven't seen it, please take a minute. It's some of the best skating I've ever seen.
I'd have to agree, except I was watching the women's ice hockey.
Yeah, that was fun too.
That was really impressive. It's great to see the game when it's played without a bag of knuckles, as the guys used to talk about it.
All right, do we have everybody?
I am not seeing Councillor Byers.
Let me give her a quick text. Let me know if she shows up. All right, well, I think we have enough to get started here, so. Let's go ahead and call this joint work session to order. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Davis,
Present.
Commissioner Bucolo,
Present.
Commissioner Diamato,
Present.
Chair Hazel,
Present.
Councilor Clark,
Here.
Councilor Panemeroff,
Here.
and I'll keep an eye out for Councilor Grader, Councilor Pestizo,
Here.
Councilor Byers,
Here.
Councilor Parra Miller.
Here, and Counselor Greider is also here.
I'm sorry, Councilor Grader.
I also
Councilor
see
Greider.
Counselor Byers, yeah.
Councilor Grader is here. Councilor Byers
Here.
and Mayor Ayers Flood.
Here,
There's a quorum, Mayor.
thank you, Hector. So the item on the agenda is meeting accessibility 2.1. Hector?
This is a question for the public. If anybody would like this meeting translated into Spanish, please raise your hand. And es una pregunta para el público. Si alguien necesitará esta reunión interpretada en español, por favor, alce su mano. This is a question for the public. If anybody needs this meeting interpreted into Spanish, please raise your hand now. And es una pregunta para el público. Si alguien necesitará esta reunión interpretada en español, por favor, alce su mano hoy. And I'll watch the attendees, Mayor.
Thank you, Hector. Okay, sorry, I'm flipping back and forth between two screens. Okay, item number 3 on the agenda is presentation on affordable housing programs with Linda Reed, Ashland Housing Programs Manager. Staff report.
Good evening, counselors and commissioners. I'm happy to see you all here tonight. I'm Kristen Mays, the Community Development Director, and Linda Reed is here with us tonight. She's from the she's the Housing Program Manager for the City of Ashland, and she's here to present to us their affordable housing program and how they came about that housing program and what they are doing today and how they manage that program on a year-to-year basis and daily. So I will turn it over to Linda. And we're so happy to have you here, Linda. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to be here as well, and I'm happy to talk with you all about the City of Ashland's Affordable Housing Program and its history and all of that fun stuff. And I actually have a PowerPoint presentation, and let's see if I can share screen, and let me open it. And then let me switch it to this. See if I can do that. Can I do that? I can. Yay. Great. I love it when technology works. Okay, so thank you, Ms. Mays, for that lovely introduction. Yes, I am Linda Reed, the City of Ashland's Housing Program Manager, and I administer a couple of things, one of which is the City of Ashland's housing program, and the other is the City of Ashland's community development block grant program, which I'm not going to talk about necessarily tonight, but certainly if we want to, we can talk a little bit about it. So we'll just jump right in, and I'm not sure how you guys want to do this, but I'm open to whichever. You can ask questions as we go, or we can hold the questions till the end. Whichever works best for you guys, I'm happy to do. Sometimes it's easier to do it during the presentation, just because things come up for people. So if that's comfortable, go ahead and feel free. Although if you raise your hands, I may not see you because I'm only seeing a little bit of the screen right now. So as the slide talks about, the affordable housing program in Ashland is applied to various activities that the city undertakes to address the unmet housing needs within our community. Obviously, there's no way that we could address every housing issue that faces the city, but we do try by bringing forward a comprehensive approach. And as Ms. Mays pointed out, this approach has evolved over time. So what I generally tell people is that our housing program is a very unique and nuanced program. There aren't very many housing programs in the state like the City of Ashland's. And the housing program consists primarily of land use regulations and financial assistance through direct grants and fee waivers. We'll talk a little bit about that. The city's program began in the early 90s with a system development charge deferral program. And since then, it has expanded over time to include a variety of additional financial provisions, including community development block grant funds. The city established a housing trust fund in 2008. We'll talk a little bit more about how that is funded. In some instances, the city has land banked land and then use that land bank land as a donation through an RFQ process to developers. The city also continues to waive system development charges, and we'll go into that a little bit more as well. The city also waives engineering and community development fees, and in some instances, the school construction excise tax, which not all communities have. Let's see here. So as I mentioned just briefly before, the city is an entitlement jurisdiction for CDBG funding. And then the rest of the funds, though, are primarily out of the city's general fund, either through the non-collection of fees, such as the waiver of system development charges, or through the dedication of funds, such as with the Affordable Housing Trust Funds. And so you can see through this little flow chart, you know, CDBG is its own separate thing. Then there's the city's general fund. The city collects marijuana tax and has dedicated the first $100,000 in marijuana tax revenue that the city receives each year to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. On the other side, the city waives SDCs, which it's a process that can be a little bit confusing to people, but essentially when a new affordable housing development or is constructed, the city essentially deed restricts the units for the amount that we waived. And those waived fees essentially do not have to be paid through the life of the development, as long as it maintains its affordable status. If that housing unit is for some reason falls out of affordability or is used in a way that is not commensurate with the resale restriction that we've recorded in the trust deed and the promissory note, then we essentially would say you need to pay us back those fees plus interest. So our original program in 1992, the System Development Charge Deferral Program, when it was established, we had a 20-year period of affordability, and homeowners were able to pay off that and buy out of their affordability at any time with interest. And we did lose a lot of units that way. Not a lot, I wouldn't say a lot, but some. And then let's see, so that was 1992. In about 2004, we changed our program to be a 30-year deed restriction with no buyout. So anyone who received a system development charge deferral after that was not able to sell their unit outside the program for market rate and just pay off the SDCs out of the proceeds. Because by that time, the market had changed so much that it was more advantageous for homeowners to go ahead and sell their units at market rate and then just pay us back the SDCs with the interest, because the amount of money that they would realize out of that sale was much greater. So let's see. So that's the what I would call the carrots. So financial, most people would say this. Financial incentives in our programs are the carrots to sort of bring the developments to the table. But the city also has enacted several land use policies that incentivize affordable housing. And I tend to call those the sticks. So they're the regulatory requirements that compel affordability in certain circumstances. So these are the four main ways that the city compels affordability through land use policies. We have a condominium conversion ordinance in place that essentially impacts rental housing converting to for sale ownership housing. In certain circumstances, those developments would have to provide a portion of the development as affordable housing. Usually 25% in that conversion. And if the development is large enough, I think it's 50 or more, then they cannot convert at all. We don't have a lot of that anymore, but we did early on. I think in 2007, when the condo conversion ordinance was passed, we were seeing a lot of rental housing units convert to condominiums, and our rental housing stock was being depleted at an alarming rate, which was the impetus for passing that policy. The city also has an annexation and zone change regulation on the books, which is unusual, but we've had it on there for a long time. And some people wonder if this is considered a takings. It's not, because essentially the developers are getting a value for the affordable housing that they're providing. In the instances where a developer wants to annex a piece of land into the city, and since you're all planning commissioners, I'm sure you know what this means. So, they lived on a rural residential piece of property and they could build one house, but if they bring it into the city and it gets rezoned, they can build 15 or 20, and they have the choice to dedicate a portion of that property as affordable housing. And there's several ways they can do that. We have a sliding scale essentially that says, if you want to target higher income households, then you would provide more housing units. Or if you're targeting the very lowest income households, then you would provide fewer units. And there's a little more information that gets a little more detail about that. The zone change ordinance is the exact same thing. So if you have a piece of property and you want to upzone it so that you could put more units on that property, the city feels that that is a benefit to you, and that you, in exchange for that benefit, that you should provide a benefit to the community, and that benefit is affordable housing. So this is the detail I was speaking about regarding annexations and zone changes. A little bit more about the condominium conversion ordinance, and then about the density bonus, which I didn't talk about in the last slide, but exists as well. So the city has, for many years, allowed builders to develop additional units if they provide affordable housing units, and it essentially worked out to be 1-for-1 for many years. And what we saw is that no one took advantage of that. It just wasn't enough of an incentive to compel developers to provide that. So in 2014, we updated our resolution and made it a 2-for-1. So for every one affordable housing unit that a developer provides voluntarily in their development, then they can build an additional 2 market rate units to offset the costs and subsidize that affordable housing unit. So the city also has some land use incentives which are not deed restricted. So I probably should go back and talk a little bit about that. I actually have a bunch of notes here and I get ahead of myself and don't cover everything I need to. So when the city has a property that is comes into the affordable housing program, the city records a deed restriction which limits the use of the property, who it can be sold to, and the maximum purchase price. And along with that, if they have any financial subsidies into that property, such as an SDC deferral or a grant from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund or from the CDBG fund, we would also record a trust deed and a promissory note. And those get attached to the title of the property. So we also have land use incentives that are not deed restricted. So these are incentives or mechanisms that provide a variety of tools with which to incentivize the provision of affordable housing to a range of incomes that are not currently met by the market. So these are not deed restricted units, but they are policies that the city has passed that helps us to incentivize the development of those housing types which we've identified as needed. We have an accessory dwelling unit ordinance, and then a cottage housing ordinance, and then we also have minimum densities, and then we allow a lot of mixed use in different circumstances. I don't know how that happened. So of course, all of this takes some administration. I mentioned before about how we deed restrict the units. So primarily my time at in the affordable housing program is to work with developers and property owners to provide information about the city's affordable housing program. Like I said, we have carrots and we have sticks, but I think my presence at the city is a carrot. So developers who may want to take advantage of some of the subsidies that we provide can talk to me and we can see whether it will work for their development, see if there's ways that they hadn't thought of that we could include some of our subsidies or work with other affordable housing providers to meet those requirements. So that's one of the administrative roles that I serve. And then, of course, just completing the legal documents to ensure affordability. So that is a big part of my role. And then part of that, too, is that when these units transfer from one household to another, to ensure that they're transferring within the program regulations, I complete income review processes with all of the either new homeowners or in some cases with renters. And then I also work with our Housing and Human Services Commission to educate the public about the city's affordable housing program. But I also work with just regular citizens who are calling because they heard the city has some sort of a housing program to find out how do they access that resource. A lot of the work I do is working with affordable housing developers. A lot of that is around our policy development and how our program works or does not work for them. That's a really important piece. And we just went through a huge policy adjustment based on a lot of the feedback that we've gotten over the years. And part of that is about removing barriers, essentially barriers for the development of these needed housing types that we have identified through research and reports, which most cities do, including us. So just a little bit about the outcomes for these programs. Because the city, I think the city is really fortunate because we have had such a long history with this affordable housing program that we've been able to see a lot of benefits. One of which is what works and what doesn't work for our population and our developers. And as you can see, the SDC deferral program has created a number of units over the years. And this is the one program where I mentioned that people can buy out. Also, our program started in 1992 and those original deed restrictions were only for 20 years. So many of them have expired. And so this is a program where slowly over time we lose that, that deed restricted affordable housing. But in this program, we had deed restricted about 133 units. All told, we have about 170 units in our program, and many of those are owned or managed by affordable housing providers. So those units, I don't do the transfers. I don't oversee the transfers because an affordable housing provider whose mission it is to serve a low-income population is doing that. And so I know that that threshold is being met. So there is a little overlap in a lot of the programs that we do. And this is where if you tried to add up all the numbers on these slides, they would not add up to 170 because most affordable housing providers, like this is a picture of Snowberry Brook in Ashland while it was under construction. The Housing Authority of Jackson County applied for community development block grant funds for this project and were granted I think $380,000 in order to complete the sidewalks and some of the public infrastructure. But they also received about $500,000 in SDC deferrals for these 60 units. And really what that means for us, for Ashland, was that the Housing Authority could have bought a piece of property in Medford and applied for this tax credit project and built it in Medford, because Medford has cheaper land than Ashland does. But that $500,000 subsidy was the difference between buying land in Medford and buying land in Ashland. So essentially that was the carrot we used to entice them to come and build something in our neck of the woods, rather than going with Medford, where they could have, there was a lot of, much larger flat pieces of land that are fairly inexpensive. And I have heard many times from the Housing Authority that this is one of their most successful and popular developments. So we're really happy about that. Affordable housing trust funds have been helpful already. So as I said, the Housing Trust Fund was adopted in 2008. It was established in 2008, but we didn't really have an ongoing funding source until 2017, until very recently. And so the first time that we offered our affordable housing trust funds was in 2018, and we awarded $300,000 to Columbia Care for them to acquire some property on which to build a 30-unit complex, which is currently under construction. And that was the first time that we offered our affordable housing trust funds. And what we realized is that we needed to build up that fund to make it enough money to entice developers. So we only offer affordable housing trust funds every other year, so that there's enough money to make it meaningful. We also offer this funding concurrent with our community development block grant funding, so that a developer could pair the two and essentially increase the amount of money they can ask for. And then the city's land use policies. This is just a little bit more about that, just how many units we've seen through these different policies. Let's see here. So I think that is the general overview of the city's affordable housing program. And I will open it up to questions if you'd like. I did include a slide with just a couple of links on here, and of course my email address. The links are to just a sort of general overview of the affordable housing program. And then within that overview is some more in-depth looks at all of the pieces that we talked about here. And then the housing program brochure, which it provides a breakdown as well. And I did want to mention that the City of Ashland's affordable housing program is funded through the City of Ashland's general fund at a 0.5 FTE. And the other 0.5 FTE of my full-time position is funded through the CDBG program through administrative costs. So I just thought you might be interested in knowing how the city has funded this program. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that I can see you all in case you have some questions. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Member D'Amato?
Hi, Linda.
Hi, Anna.
You may have said this earlier and I may have missed it. The Housing Trust Fund, how is that funded? Where is the money coming from?
So, in 2008, we dedicated some old housing rehab repayments that didn't really amount to much. And then we also had a little donation piece when one of our housing commissioners passed away. His wife set up a memorial fund for him to go into the trust fund. And then in 2017, when the marijuana tax came about in the state, when marijuana was legalized, the city council decided to dedicate the first $100,000 in marijuana tax revenue that the city collects to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. There have actually been maybe 1 or 2 years where we didn't collect more than 100,000. We actually collected less, but we still got all of that into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And that's actually part of the reason why we let it build up over a couple of year period, because, $100,000 sadly is just not that much money.
No, not for Ashland. Thank you. I didn't make that connection. The marijuana fund money went into the trust fund. But thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Commissioner Bucalo?
Hi, quick question about requirements for projects. We're looking at for talent for affordability requirements proposed only for units or for developments with 20 units or more. Do you have any kind of scaling similarities in Ashland?
So, I think that is a state legislative piece that they're
It is.
compel affordability. And we had looked at passing that. I mean, we already have that affordability requirement on our books, but not necessarily for units of 20 or more. We don't get a whole lot of units or a whole lot of developments that are bigger than 20 units. I mean, in fact, the only ones we get are affordable housing providers building multifamily housing, and they're already providing affordability. And through the years, because we have to do a lot of research around our housing needs, and then, sort of match that up through that process that I spoke about, where we sort of look at barriers to providing, essentially what we're trying to incentivize. And the feedback that we got from developers was that they just won't build 20 units or more if we pass that regulation, that they'll just build 19. So I don't know if that actually answered your question. We just don't get a lot of developments in that size, and the feedback we got was we can work around that if that's what you're going to do. Mayor Ayers?
Yeah. You talked about when the city annexes land or when they rezone, having affordable construction required, like 2 to 1, I think I heard you say. So I totally get the annexation piece, but can you cite some examples of when rezoning has triggered that kind of mix?
Yeah, I have a really good example of that was very successful. So former Ashland Planning Commissioner Melanie Minlin, who some of you may or may not know, had a piece of property on which she wanted to develop a co-housing development. And so she had that piece of property rezoned so she could get the density that she needed in order to make this dream a reality. And so that development actually has 2 units of affordable housing included in it, which have been very popular, and everyone just loves that development. So in the bonus, so you were asking also about the bonus density. So with the bonus density situation, if you wanted to build 10 units and you can fit, I mean, obviously it has to meet all of the other planning requirements, the setbacks, and but we would allow you to develop 2 market rate units for every 1 affordable unit above what would be required. So if a developer who wasn't required to build any affordable housing could take advantage of that. But if you also were required to build affordable housing, you could do that as well. So I don't know, did my co-housing example answer your question?
Yeah, and I think, we recently had an applicant want us to rezone some commercial property into housing property. So would that be an example of the type of rezoning that you're talking about, or?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not sure who you're playing. Oh, Ms. Mays. So, probably not commercial property. So ours is more geared to already zoned residential properties and increasing the zoning of that property so that you could have more units. So you're getting benefit. I am not entirely sure. So Ms. Mays, correct me if I'm wrong, but rezoning commercial property to residential is a different process. At least for us, we would probably have to go through like an economic development study to make sure that we weren't taking away a needed land type. Is that, Ms. Mays, is that correct for talent?
Well, in this case, what the mayor is referring to is they requested to rezone from commercial to housing, so they would actually be benefiting from the housing, building market rate housing. And so I think she was interested in knowing, then could we then put that 2 to 1 onto that housing? Does Ashland do that? And I believe we probably could. We could request that, if you want to build a higher density, then you could show us that you're going to put for your residential development, that you're going to put an affordable component in there.
Yeah, and what I would say is that currently Ashland's policies don't relate to the rezoning of land from one designation to another. So not from commercial to residential, it would only apply to land that's already zoned residential. However, if you wanted to, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. The developer is going to see a much greater value in property that's zoned for residential development than they ever would for probably a commercial development. Just at least, I mean, I'm sure your market isn't that different from ours, and there's a much greater market for housing in Ashland than there is for commercial property.
But Ashland does not do that for commercial development to residential, just to upzone to a higher, okay.
Yes, that's exactly right. I hope that made sense to
Yeah.
everyone.
It did, just really quickly though, but SB 8 changed all that, right? I mean, do I understand that right, Kristen? Didn't SB 8 change that where you can zone from, you can build in commercial zones, you can build residential and commercial zones now, as long as it's affordable housing, right?
I'm not certain about that, Mayor.
Okay, thanks. And it's not really important.
Elizabeth can answer that maybe.
Yeah, good evening. Just been enjoying this presentation, but yes, the short answer is SB 8 does allow entirely residential projects to be built in commercial zones if they meet all the affordability requirements under SB 8. But we'll talk about it a little bit more in our presentation as well.
Oh, that's great. That's actually, I think I've heard just a little bit about that, but I don't know a whole lot about it yet. So thank you for bringing that up. I wrote it down.
Good.
Any other questions? Elizabeth?
I'm sorry, I'm not a commissioner, but if I could ask one that's relevant to our work later. You just had mentioned that your 1-to-1 ratio for the rezoning wasn't, and annexations wasn't effective. And I'm curious, has the 2-to-1 gotten any takers? Like, does
You know, I have to say, I don't think it has. No. And it may be, I mean, at this point, it may be other factors. You know, the housing market has been really crazy. Obviously, everybody knows that. And, you know, we just redid our whole affordable housing program ordinance and resolution because, you know, the last time we had updated it was in 2006, and we just live in a very different world now. And there were a lot of aspects of our program that just were not getting us what we needed. And in fact, the feedback that we were getting from both affordable housing and private market developers was that we had created an impossible program that nobody could work within. And so, you know, we thought, well, you know, we didn't do this on purpose. What's going on? What is different? What needs to change? And so we did a public engagement and outreach project. We did a lot of work. We did surveys. You know, what is it that is, what are these barriers? What would you like to see done differently? So that was our most recent change, which was adopted, I think, at the end of 2019 or maybe in the middle of the pandemic. It all just blurs to me now. And it was so recent that unfortunately we really haven't had a lot of development take advantage of, you know, any of the new policies. We do have, we streamlined one of the processes that we had. So all of the discussions that I had had with private market developers in the past probably year before the pandemic were essentially that the amount of subsidy needed to provide the affordability that we were looking for was so much that they could not make it up on the other portions of their project, was essentially what private market developers were telling us. And that in order for them to even make that a reality, they needed to have better partnerships with affordable housing providers who had access to different funding sources who could get that deep subsidy. So we streamline our process through annexation and zone change, that the affordability portions that we would compel could then be essentially not donated. They could sell the land, but they could be partnered with an affordable housing provider who could then go through their own process on their own timeline outside of any planning application that the private market developer went through. So early on, private market developers could do that, right? But then we got burned and they didn't finish their projects, or they just languished, or they, you know, parked RVs on them for 5 years. And then tried to sell them to an affordable housing developer using our money. So we decided, yeah, that wasn't really working for us. But the real issue in private and affordable developers partnering was that affordable housing providers have an application process through the state and federal government that is outside of any private developer's schedule. And then in order to make those things work, we had to divorce the projects essentially and say, you know, as long as it's dedicated through, you know, a recording to an affordable housing provider whose mission it is to provide this housing type, then we know that that will get developed as that housing type. And they could use their own timeline that suits their grant cycle and their development process. And so that was my super long answer to a question about why we haven't seen the 2-for-1 yet. I think it is because we really had a policy that wasn't working right for the reality of the development world at the time. And hopefully now we do, and maybe we'll see that happen.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Amrith?
Yeah, and I think I heard, but I may have gotten it wrong because, you know, like it's a blur, right? But there was a recent housing development, I think, in Ashland that was a private developer partnering with Habitat for Humanity.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering how that was arranged and what you leveraged as far as your policies for that.
So that was our first development under this new policy. And it is still, it's still in planning. So it hasn't, the planning has been approved, but it hasn't broken ground yet. And essentially, I mean, it was, you know, feedback from both private market, the private market developer involved in that and the and Habitat for Humanity that helped us to change our policies. One of which was, you know, I facilitate the conversations between the developer and the affordable housing provider. Essentially, the developer annexed some property, so was required to provide a portion of affordable housing. And then they came to me and said, okay, I want to dedicate this, or actually they did just donate them the land to Habitat. But who is going to do the sort of development that I want? This actually gets to something that is just an issue in our whole county, which is that we don't have a lot of capacity in affordable housing development. This particular developer wanted ownership units, and there are not very many affordable housing development organizations in Jackson County who provide ownership housing. They wanted them to, you know, blend in with the development that they were doing already. And Habitat, through their feedback, had outlined a couple of things to us. One, that a 60-year period of affordability for ownership units was just, you know, wouldn't work with their lending models. And that really made sense to us. Most people have a 30-year mortgage. It's really hard to have a 30-year mortgage when you have a 60-year affordability deed restriction on your property. So we we modified our resolution to say that in ownership units, we would only deed restrict them for a period of 30 years in certain circumstances. So annexation and zone change have a 60-year affordability. SDCs have a 30-year affordability. This project will get both. So in this instance, that 60 years has now, under a new resolution, has been reduced to 30 years for ownership units, with the recognition that this is really about lending that more so than sort of long-term affordability. And honestly, 30 years is pretty long-term. So that was a way that Habitat for Humanity could do projects in Ashland again, because our annexation ordinance did not work for their lending model.
Thanks.
Yes.
Did I hear you correctly that in this project, and I think there's eight homes for 8 units for Habitat for Humanity, is that right? 8 in that project?
I feel like it was 5, but
5. Okay, I'm sure I'm wrong and you're right. So did I hear you say that 5 units were donated to the organization and there were SDC waivers?
So the landowner, the developer, donated a commensurate amount of land to develop the number of units that they would be required to develop. So as I said, our annexation and zone change policies have a sliding scale, and it depends on what income target you have, how many units you'll have to provide. And so the original planning application identified that target income, obviously through communication with the affordable housing provider. And then they just dedicated the amount of land to the affordable housing provider that would meet that requirement. And in fact, I think they dedicated a little bit more. So they're getting a few more, or 1 or 2 more units than they normally would. And then let's see, I feel like I didn't answer your question fully, that they're missing a little piece of it here.
They also got SDC waivers?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that reminder. Yes, so because their units will meet our criteria for the SDC waiver, which is 80% of area median income or below for home ownership and 60% of area median income or below for rental projects, they will receive a waiver of those fees on those 5 units, which I believe, it's for us, I think we're up to about $15,000 a unit. So that can be a pretty substantial savings that can be passed on to the homeowners through a reduced cost.
Thank you.
And I should say, because the city of Ashland is an entitlement jurisdiction for community development block grant funds, we made our affordable housing program consistent with the CDBG program in many ways, one of which is that we use community development block grant income guidelines, which are updated by HUD each year. And we just do that so that when people do use our affordable housing program, either an SDC deferral or the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and they also apply for CDBG funds, that they will all be consistent across the board.
Any other questions? And at this time, I'll go ahead and look to the attendees. If you have any questions on this agenda item, please raise your hand. I'm sorry, everybody, I have my camera off because I'm finishing dinner, so. Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much for this great presentation.
Yeah.
You're doing great work there in Ashland, Linda. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really nice chatting with you guys. I hope that this information was helpful to you. And I also want to say that feel free to reach out to me via email or phone if you have any further questions or just, want to know how things are going in Ashland. Thanks and have a great night.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that was great. Item number 4 on the agenda is work session with Elizabeth Decker regarding affordable residential options in commercial zones. Staff report.
Thank you, Mayor. So once again, we have Elizabeth here. We're glad to see Elizabeth. She's going, as you said, she's going to be presenting our draft zoning code updates for our commercial zones that currently permit additional residential uses in this commercial neighborhood, commercial business district, and commercial business highway zones. And this will also include a component of our of some affordable housing and workforce housing. So Elizabeth, take it away.
Well, wonderful. Good evening, Mayor, members of the council, and members of the Planning Commission, as well as staff. Thank you for having me again. Always a pleasure to talk about affordable housing, and I really appreciated that setup from Ashland. I mean, this is just an affordable housing evening. So I think that the first thing that I just want to start with is to, remind us that the proposed code before you that addresses affordable housing and workforce housing in commercial zones is really a piece of the city's future affordability strategy, right? And I think that we really heard how important it is to have multiple sticks as well as multiple carrots, particularly some of those financial incentives like the Sdc waivers, other, whether it's a housing trust fund or different ways that you might use your CET that you've been collecting, so that any of those types of measures should also be considered in parallel with the code that's before you tonight. Again, this is a work session, so we're here just to go over what the very initial draft code looks like, get your initial reactions, answer questions and any clarifications, hear from you whether it generally aligns with the city's policy goals and the direction that you'd provided at an earlier work session, as well as hear your desire about moving this forward towards adoption. And then along those lines here, particular any code revisions or questions or additional work that you'd like to see done on the code before it moves forward. So in terms of background, as many of you were engaged in the 2021 code update that we started back in 2019, and during the adoption process for that, Planning Commission and City Council tabled discussion of these commercial zones, wanting to pull those out and take a little bit more time, as we are doing right now, to develop an affordability component to partner with any expanded residential use aspect in that code. And so the draft code that we're reviewing tonight and considering is intended to respond to that request. We had a joint work session here, gosh, just yesterday, but it was back in October. And we heard direction at the joint work session from both bodies to allow what we termed moderate residential uses in the commercial zones, provided they incorporate both affordable and or workforce housing components. And so the moderate sort of fell in between the small and the large ends of the spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum was to simply implement SB 8 and permit regulated affordable housing projects that are required in commercial zones. And that we heard was maybe not enough progress that the city was interested to take. But on the other end of simply outright permitting residential uses as a primary use in commercial zones, that seemed like too far on the spectrum. So we're aiming to be in the middle somewhere with the moderate housing, and that's the tiered approach that we've brought forward tonight. And all of this is intending to fit within the city's overarching policy goals, specifically to address the development of affordable and market rate housing to meet the needs of talent households. As we all know, the housing crisis affects talent, affects statewide, and there are particular challenges in talent. And so the Planning Commission and City Council are certainly to be commended for your interest and efforts to take some steps in the code, as well as additional supportive measures to do everything we can to bring more housing to the city. And specifically, since we're looking at commercial land with these code updates, we're thinking about how these code updates can effectively utilize that commercial land base to provide some additional residential development opportunities. One piece that got mentioned in the previous work item addressing whether commercial land should be used for residential is just another background piece that the most recent economic analysis and talent did find that there is a small surplus of commercial land over and above the employment needs. And so that's part of what prompted us down this long path that we've been on to really see that commercial land as a resource that can help address this overarching and pressing need for housing at the same time as still meeting the city's employment needs. So hopefully not in conflict, but supportive of each other. So a quick refresher on where residential uses in commercial currently stand. So right now, the commercial neighborhood and the commercial business district, that's the downtown zone, multifamily is permitted in upper stories. You can also do live work units and one ground floor unit in downtown. And I believe that one is really tied to the fact that there's a lot of smaller size parcels, and it allows for the addition of one unit for, say, the owner of the property or the person running the shop that can live on site there. The commercial business highway district, that is traditionally where the city has experimented with permitting more residential. Multifamilies permitted in upper stories there, as well as up to 50% of the ground floor. And so like the Clearview project, some of which is no longer standing, that as I was told, was developed under some of those provisions. And in the commercial highway and the commercial interchange zones, right now, those are restricted to upper story multifamily. Here you can see, just a refresher, always nice to look at the map and get a sense of where the zones are. As we've mentioned a few times, the CN, the commercial neighborhood zone, really only affects a very small handful of parcels down here on Creel Road. And the whole impetus behind even including it in these zoning code updates was not because the CN zone was seen as some sort of, great resource or land bank that could be turned into residential uses, but that by developing it as a tool in the zoning code, then that zone might be more appropriate for future application and particularly future rezones for projects that we're looking to do more of a mix of residential and commercial. But with the proposed update, we are, the draft before you includes changes to that commercial neighborhood, as well as the downtown district and CBD and the CBH commercial highway zone here on either side of Pacific Highway. So it really hopefully expands a lot of the scope of the city and potential projects that could be affected. Okay, so with that, any questions on the background quickly before we get into the code proposal? I shall plow forward. So first of all, there are 4 code sections that are in your packet. The first of which has to do with definitions. I learned a long time ago as a planner, lawyers always say read the definitions first. And so the key here is defining what we mean by affordable housing and what we mean by workforce housing. So you heard some of these numbers addressed in Ashland, and some of these pieces line up. Some of them are a little bit different. What we're proposing for the definitions, the affordable housing definition is proposed at up to 80% of AMI, and that aligns with the SB 8 definition of affordability. So we wanted to keep those in parallel. Some cities define it down to 60%. I think you heard Ashland say that for some rental projects, it's down to 60%, but we were concerned that that would create a gap where, a project that came in that 60 to 80 might meet certain standards, but might not qualify under the talent code. So we thought that 80% was more appropriate to make it more, to make it align better. We picked that 30-year affordability term, again, for some of the reasons that you heard Ashland say about mortgages and lending, as well as traditional requirements for regulated affordable projects through things like the LIHTC, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program administered by the state. And these projects, these are the units that you're typically going to see built by nonprofits and government agencies, more in that regulated realm of specialized developers. What we also heard from the council back in October and from the Planning Commission was a desire to incorporate workforce housing. And so we did some research into that and are proposing to define workforce housing as units that are affordable for families making up to 120% of the area median income. What's interesting is that workforce housing is not, there's not as much general agreement around what that means compared to affordable housing. But 120% seemed like that translates to about $70,000 a year for a family of 3, which, is not scraping by, but you could still see how there could be some challenges getting into the housing market with annual incomes in that range, given how crazy the housing market is these days. So that's how we settled on the 120 in the proposal, also the 30-year term. But workforce housing, we're seeing the potential that could be built by nonprofits or market rate developers. There could be some projects that would pencil. So those are the proposed definitions that set us up then for the proposed residential uses. So this is all going to sound really similar because the provisions for the 3 commercial zones have a lot of similarities, but there's just a couple small differences. So in the commercial neighborhood zone, the key here is to introduce ground floor multifamily residential uses if they include both affordable or workforce housing and a commercial storefront component. We'll get into what those percentages look like. In the CBD zone, that's the downtown again, very similar. The only difference here is that we would preserve the existing use of one unit, ground floor unit that's already permitted, and then just build from there. So 2+ units is where these standards would kick in. And then the CBH zone, similarly, we would preserve the existing development right to build ground floor multifamily up to 50% of the site. And then the standards for integrating affordable or workforce housing apply to any development that wants to do more than 50% ground floor multifamily. And no changes are proposed to the commercial highway or the commercial interchange zone. SB8 could apply. We'll go over that a bit at the end, but none of the proposed code changes would expand those because those zones were never included in the scope and not seen as the most appropriate for residential development. Another piece here is that all of these residential uses would be proposed to go through an administrative type 2 review. Because they're residential uses, they would need to be reviewed against clear and objective standards. So that makes it much more feasible to get these uses developed, and that much more important for us to get the standards written correctly into the code now, so that they can be applied on a site-by-site basis. As I mentioned, the residential standards themselves, they are nearly identical for all zones. So if you started getting some deja vu as you were reading that packet, that true, yes. I also went through that experience writing it. But we thought that the consistency was important across the zones and needed, for different code administrative purposes to be in each of those zones. So a few key standards across all these zones is that the residential types proposed are limited to multifamily units and triplex and fourplex units, which are really 3 or 4 unit. They're really small multifamily. We considered whether townhouse or cottage projects could fit into these, but given the commercial zones and the scale of development that we're looking at, we just felt that those products, although they could, fit within the building envelopes and the minimum densities, wouldn't necessarily be providing the most appropriate form as well as the greatest potential for units that could meet those income ranges. So really looking just to restrict to the multifamily and 3 to 4 unit projects. In terms of the dimensions that would apply to these projects and the massing standards, it's really the same setbacks as the underlying zone so that they stay consistent with commercial structures. But there is about 10 feet of bonus height that we're proposing for these residential uses. So in these base commercial zones, development is limited to 2.5 stories or 30 feet, and residential uses that are meeting the requirements of this program, including the ground floor and or upper stories, could go up to 3 full stories or 40 feet, whichever is less. And to ensure that this land is used efficiently, right, that it's not just, hopefully the market would guide that to begin with, but there is a minimum density proposed of 18 units per acre. That is the same as the minimum density for the city's high density residential. And this would be measured on just the portion of the project being used for residential, not the entire site. And similar to the high density zone, there is no maximum density. So really that height limit is going to be what controls the overall scale of the project. And that gives a lot more flexibility for what the size of the units are within that project without necessarily penalizing smaller units. Okay, and the core of the project, the core of the proposed standards really has to do with these affordability requirements. So I know this was just, there's a question about this in the earlier work session, and I'm glad that you savvy code readers picked up on it, and I think that it's worthy of further discussion here, is that as drafted, this will apply to projects with 20 or more units, and that's consistent with the statewide inclusionary zoning laws. Sort of their model, based on their extensive sort of statewide research, felt that they arrived at the conclusion that projects with 20 or more could financially support better this affordability component, as well as based on these ratios. It also helps us avoid some rounding problems, right? So in some of these instances, the percentage of affordable units could be as low as 5%. And so 5% is 1 unit in a 20-unit project, but in any smaller project, now we're into fractional units. And so there's some questions about, would you round up, would you round down, and how to go from there. But it does raise some of the questions that were discussed earlier, that does this merely incentivize 19-unit projects? Does it leave too many projects outside the bounds of this? But on the other end, we're looking at some examples of, say, a smaller lot in downtown where there was the ability to develop, say, 3 units, but to require 1 of the 3 to be affordable might make the whole project unfeasible. And therefore, is it worth losing the 3 over trying to get the 1? And so maybe 3 isn't the right number. Maybe 20 isn't the right number. As I said, 20 was selected because of the consistency with the research that went into those inclusionary zoning laws. But there could be a different number that we get some direction here, or some other direction on how to arrive at a number that might better fit. So before we talk about the percentages, I also just wanted to highlight that based on some questions and direction from the Planning Commission and City Council at our previous work session, there is the final code section talks about unit equivalency standards. And those are essentially trying to get at the idea that any units that are proposed as affordable units should be just as nice and equivalent to the market rate units, that there shouldn't be a lower, lesser quality or size or other way of just clearly distinguishing which ones are the affordable units. So that is integrated in. And then as far as these percentages go, you'll see that they look pretty similar to what we discussed back at the work session. They're a range between 5 to 20% of affordable units. And for each additional 5% of units that are proposed to be affordable, you get an additional 25% of the gross site area that can be developed as ground floor residential. So this is a little bit different than the Ashland, sort of 1 unit for 2 units or the unit ratios. The idea being that there was a little bit more flexibility in how the site was used this way. And it also built on the way that the commercial business highway district was already structured. Okay, and what we have added to this proposal since our last discussion is to also include an equivalent number of workforce units. So as I mentioned, the workforce units are up to 120% AMI. There really is less research on workforce units and bonuses. And so as an initial proposal, as Ashland mentioned, they have, different units are worth different amounts. Building to 120% AMI rent levels is easier than 80%. So as an initial proposal, these come in at double the affordable. So instead of 5%, 10% of workforce units, et cetera. And potentially there could also be a mix of the 2 units. And we can, work this into the table or come up with some other clever code language to address that if that is of interest. All right, and then the other key requirement is that, to return to where we began, these are commercial zones. And so there remains a storefront commercial requirement for what will essentially be a horizontal mixed use site for all projects that have, depending on how much affordability they have, as well as how much ground floor residential, then there's the remainder of the site needs to include a commercial use component. And there's some definitions and standards proposed about how that needs to be located on the site frontage so that there maintains some commercial viability on the site. And, as you get to 75% or more residential, again, this aligns with if you had an entire affordable residential project, then there would of course you'd be using it 100% residential, there would be no commercial use requirement. And that aligns, pretty well, perfectly, I would say, with SB 8 in that it effectively outright permits affordable residential projects. I will say, just from a code writing perspective, this idea of what does it mean to be a commercial use and to occupy the site frontage could use a little bit of refinement. So that's something that I can keep working on to ensure that it doesn't just become, say, a parking lot right along the main frontage. We wouldn't want to see that as a commercial use, but we also want it to be flexible enough that it can be used. Okay, so SB8, we had some questions about, should we just let SB8 be implemented? Could we design something that builds on SB8? And the goal with these code updates is that they build on top of SB8 and align fairly seamlessly with it by using the same definition of affordable housing and allowing projects that do meet that definition to be permitted outright in the commercial zones without any requirement for a commercial use component. I'll just note that the two zones that are not proposed for code updates, the commercial highway and commercial interchange zones, those would also be affected by SB8 if someone were to purchase a project or a parcel and want to develop affordable housing there. And we don't need to do any local code changes to make that happen. As SB8 applies, it uses the existing dimensional standards in commercial zones. It does have bonus height and bonus density, but those only apply in residential zones, like in multifamily zones. So in these commercial zones, the height limits that we are proposing for the 3 zones under discussion, the 3 stories of 40 feet would apply. And then the existing standards for commercial highway and commercial interchange would also apply. There wouldn't be any additional height there. And then because of the way the code is structured, currently there would not be a maximum density, just that height limit. So that's how SB8 would factor into this. And with that, I will turn it over to the Planning Commission and City Council to discuss and consider future direction, particularly, here to answer your questions, provide any clarification, hear the direction from officials about how to move forward with adoption, what additional steps you might be looking for, and particularly what kinds of code revisions or areas of future research you'd like to see to support that future adoption process. So thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Are there any questions from council or commission? Looking. Jordan?
Great, thanks, Mayor. I would just love to just make a quick comment because I was reviewing just sales data today of what properties are currently for sale in Talent. And this timing just feels really on point since we're seeing a lot of the commercial properties in the zones that Elizabeth highlighted in that first map are for sale right now. So I'm really looking forward to getting some stuff in our code to see if it has an impact as the town continues to rebuild. So excited that you're all here tonight. Thanks for being here.
Great point to make. Thank you, Jordan. Anybody have any questions or comments? Councilor Panamarev?
Yeah, thanks. And I think I might be confusing flex space and some other conversations in the past, but it has to do with if you're building, horizontal split between commercial and residential, is it expensive like commercial to build the whole thing, or is there any cost savings there?
I am not a professional developer, but that, as I believe, there are cost savings by making it horizontal rather than vertical. However, I think it would depend on, there's details, right? Particularly if it's all in the same structure. If anyone knows more about building codes, I don't know if you can designate different areas or what aspects have to be the same for the exterior envelope. But the other big promise of horizontal mixed use is that they can be separate structures. And so one could be built to residential and one to commercial code.
I do know that commercial development and residential development are very, very different, and they have completely different codes, and they generally have to be, there has to be a serious separation between the two. So as Elizabeth said, you can build a separate residential unit as opposed to having to put in the fire rating wall and the sprinkler system and such. But so it is very expensive. Either way, it's building costs are extremely expensive now. So I don't know if there's much savings.
Thanks.
Councillor Clark.
Yes, thanks. First thing is the units of 20 or more as per the state IZ guidelines. I feel like that is not what I thought the intention of this was really geared toward, to be constrained by that requirement. Like they said, like she said in Ashland, there's it's just not very likely to get projects that contain 20 residential units, especially if they're considering combining a commercial component on the same lot. So I think we have to revisit that that threshold and think about the consequences of where we would set it, as you raised with your example of 3 units. In addition, she was talking about the 2-to-1 thing in Ashland, and I realized this is a different situation because we're talking about, commercial districts and mixing commercial and residential uses. But I just note that the low end of sort of taking advantage of this is with 5% residential compared to that Ashland example, which is 2-to-1, 33%. That's a big difference as far as getting the foot in the door of getting to the carrots, I guess. So yeah, those are a couple of things I want to think more about and hear other people's thoughts on as well.
Commissioner Buccolo, and then, Commissioner Buccolo.
First, I want to just say that I 100% agree with Councillor Clark as far as the 20 unit threshold thing. That was the first thing that occurred to me early on, was just, we're a small town, and it sounds like that was written for a big city. So definitely want to echo the need to revisit that. And just a quick question, what criteria is used to consider what's less or more financially viable for a developer? Is it going into the red and not making any money, or is it just making a little bit less money as far as incentives, for considering how much affordable versus traditional priced units?
Sure, I would say that we ultimately don't know that answer, in the sense of it's up to a developer to say, like, yes, I'll go forward with this project, which tells us that it's viable for them, or no, I'm not interested because it's not viable. And we don't, the city can't necessarily, ask to see those balance sheets and say, like, oh, is it just because the profit margin didn't work for you, or because it, but as I understand, there are, as we all know, there are so many different factors that go into the cost of construction. And if a project isn't viable for one reason or another, whether that's like an actual loss or merely, less profit than could otherwise be realized by a different type of project, we don't necessarily know, but we do know the projects aren't getting built.
Right on. I guess I asked because that was written in as far as like for the affordability requirements. And so, I figured there has to be some sort of metric being used or some sort of thinking. I don't know. Because we did have a rezoning issue that had come up, I don't know, maybe a year ago or something. And it was maybe 10 units, if I remember correctly. And this isn't 100%, on the same situation. But yeah, the guy was like, he wasn't going to make as much, but it was still, we were pretty much going to give him a blank check with rezoning something from commercial to residential. So it would be good to know what kind of criteria would be used, so we can be informed when we write this code.
Right, and I think that's where we talked previously about getting some an economist on board to do some more pro formas and really look through like what are the types of rate of returns that are necessary in order to make a project pencil. And when you put this many units in, how does that affect it? And, there have to be a lot of market assumptions and background understanding. And I think that there are some experts in the field that could help give us a more precise answer to that. And yet at the end, it really does sort of come down to like, does someone choose to build it or not? And we won't know the exact pro forma for each project that fails.
Right.
Is the tricky part, right? Like we
Totally.
don't, right? We never see the projects that aren't built. So it's hard to find a better way to capture them except through conversations and more modeling.
I think part of my thinking is just that with prices the way they are and just things being so wildly inflated, it's hard to imagine something sitting super vacant for very long if there's any kind of incentive whatsoever to develop. So
yeah,
I don't know, like being worried that we're not going to catch a fish when we're throwing, when we're pretty much chumming the water right now with vacant lots doesn't. I worry that we're gonna miss out on affordability because we're trying to, hopefully someone will develop. But that's all I got.
thanks.
Councilor Penamarav?
Thanks. I have a weird math question. And I'm wondering, Elizabeth, if you ever see this in code, because I got really hung up on when you said, well, 5% one unit has to be 20 because you can't chop up the units. But it's like, yeah, but you can do it like maybe like a sliding scale with the affordability. Mathematically, I don't know if it's realistic or not. So I'm wondering if you've ever seen code or that a planner would like ever consider the idea of like, okay, you could do 2 units at this rate, or you could do 5 units at this rate, which is a little bit more towards market. So in building that kind of a matrix into so we get around that whole half a unit thing.
Yeah, no, thanks. I love math questions and code. So one way to get it, the proposed code does include that 10% at the 120 AMI alternative instead of the 5% at the 80%. So 5% affordable, or you could do 10% workforce. So that is an alternative. I did take a quick look at Ashland's code while Linda was talking, and they have 3 tiers. They have 3 different ratios for 80%, 100%, and 120% AMI. So, and I think the city of Portland also has a 60% AMI. So we could complicate this further, but I stuck with those 2 tiers to start with because those seemed like the 2 areas that we had identified at the previous work session.
You say complicated, I say flexible, but yeah. So I just wanted to echo what Councilor Clark and Commissioner Bucolo says is like, I'm not really interested in just making this for big developments. I think we want to look at the small developments as well. Thanks.
Thanks.
Councilor Clark?
Oops. Yeah, this the way it's written, it seems like it's we're putting the developer either on the affordable housing path or the workforce path. Is there any did you give any thought, or is any provision in here that I'm not seeing that would allow a combination of affordable, workforce, and market all in the same project?
Yeah, no, thank you. That is an excellent observation. I also had thoughts about that. I was thinking about addressing it in a future footnote, something about like or equivalent combination thereof. So if that's something you'd like to see, we can add it to the draft.
Anybody else? I'm sorry, Commissioner Hazel?
Thanks, Elizabeth. All very useful information. Going back to Councilor Clark's comments and concerns, and Commissioner Bucolo's, I agree. And I know when we were first when we first met with the developers, previous developers on more than one occasion, it was very frustrating when they would say that doesn't pencil out. And I even asked that at one of our meetings when they were presenting. I said, what does that mean? Like, and I felt the same way. But in the reality is what Elizabeth said and what Linda also alluded to is that it's kind of a guessing game, you know, like spending the time and creating these codes and then to find out that it doesn't work, or the rules that it doesn't work, that they didn't bite. So they have the saying 1-to-1 and they got no bites on that. And how much time was spent, there were years before they realized that didn't bring anything in. And then 2014, they changed it to 2-to-1. And I was going to ask the same question Elizabeth did, and find out that that the city of Ashland has had no response on that change either, no results. And it's all like testing the waters. And I feel like that's not wasting a lot of time, but spending a lot of time just waiting and seeing if that's going to work. Because also, as Elizabeth pointed out, we cannot require them to show us what it means that it doesn't pencil out. Bottom line is, if they don't want to build it, if they want to make a certain amount of money, I don't know what else we can do to make it so that they would want to put that effort in to make what they would consider a small amount of money. And I think that's where the problem lies. I don't know what that amount of money is, but I don't know that we want to keep changing these rules, codes, and then finding out that doesn't work. I think bringing in an economist, if we can consult with one to have them help us come up with a good plan so that we could at least have a better educated guess at what might work for a code, might be the best next step forward. That's just my thought. I mean, because I feel like we've been going in circles on this and for years, and it's been really frustrating because I never felt like we were able to rein in the developers. We can't make them build something. You know, they can go somewhere else to build, or they don't have to build affordable housing. So I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm just trying to, you know, be more realistic, and that in all the time that we've spent talking about changing codes and wording, and what Linda said, like also the 20 units, that if you require them to build 20 units, or if they have 20 units, that then the affordable housing kicks in, they don't build 20 units. So there's got to be some other fix there too. You know, that's just kind of thinking out loud here, but that's my thought.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a few comments too, and then I'll go to Councilor Palmer if I just didn't raise my hand. What occurs to me is that SB 8 sort of takes care of the available lands. Really, if you look at talent and what's available, it's commercial zoning mostly, and there isn't any really big lots in the city limits that are really suitable for bigger developments or even medium-sized developments that would accommodate something like inclusionary zoning. But these are building codes that are, likely going to be used for years to come. And what occurs to me is that the buildable lands that are coming to us at some near point, and by that I say probably within 5 to 10 years, are urban reserves. And even if our housing needs analysis does not demonstrate for us that we need some of the industrial land to actually be housing, even if that were the case, there's still large swaths of housing residential lands that are in the urban reserves that'll come in and be large city-like developments because there's large pieces of land, and almost all of TA5 is residential. And I'm going to guess that our housing needs analysis will likely show a need for some of the densities in TA5 to be changed, but I'm just guessing. And with that, it seems to me that creating some kind of inclusionary zoning that would target some of the most, buildable lands that we have in our 5 to 10 year window makes sense to me. And so what occurs to me, and I haven't had a chance to really think this out because it occurred to me tonight, and I don't know if it would work or not, but in many of those cases, there's like 5 acres and 3 acres. And I mean, TA5, I'm trying to remember, there's like, a couple of 5 acre places. And so if you had an inclusionary zoning at 18 units, required at 18 units, and if the minimum density is 18, then it doesn't seem to me that they can build at that density without having some inclusionary zoning, but I could be wrong. I haven't really thought this through. And so, and if you set it up in such a way where they could say, well, if we said 20 and they said, well, I'm going to build 19, well, they could do that. But if we said 18 and they said, well, I'm going to build 17, then they couldn't do that in some of the densities. So, and then if they were the same owner that wanted to build 3 acres and they did it 1 acre at a time, if the rules said that that it was contiguous in some way over time. I mean, I might be overcomplicating it, but it seems to me that there is room for discussion on that. And we should be, to some degree, looking at not what we have for inclusionary zoning, but what we will have for inclusionary zoning. And that's quite a bit of urban reserve and a huge amount. I can't remember the acres, but I'm sure it's over 25 of housing. So I hope that we keep plugging away at this inclusionary zoning. And I mean, I think SB8 takes care of what's in town for the most part, but we should be, I would hope that the discussion is focused on what we will have in the future. Jordan?
Councilor Preciso did have his hand before me, but I do have something to add on to what the mayor said. Is what I would love to do, Chris and I were discussing this before the meeting, is work with Nikki, who's our JS specialist, to actually help us run an analysis for what would be the acreage of all of the properties in the zones that we're discussing, both the urban reserve areas as well as current city limits, just to help give the commission and the council an understanding of what specific properties would be impacted by the way the code is written. And Mayor, I think that can go to your point to help us see, where would this apply and how could it affect us in 5 to 10 years?
Thank you, Jordan. And I apologize, Councilor Postizo, you were not in my little screen grouping. I've got like limited screen grouping and I didn't see your hand. So please, I apologize. Councilor Postizo.
Yeah, that's all right. Was started thinking a little differently. I like everything you said, though, just for the record. And I also struggle with the 20 unit threshold because that just doesn't really seem like it applies very well in Talent. But, as I listened to Ashland and I listened to this presentation, it just, and in conversations I've had with, John Lagarza and other people in town, it seems like the real way to get affordable housing is to get, the nonprofit, housing authority kind of folks and others in here. And so I'm wondering, so I heard all this and Ashland's doing some things and they were sort of trying to get partnerships going, but I'm not really noticing how our proposed code is addressing that. And it could be because this is specific to commercial, residential and commercial, I'm not sure, but it seems like that's really where the likely payoff is, because they're actually motivated to build the low-income housing, not just, do it if they have to. So I'm not sure what we can do with that, but that's just what I've been thinking as I'm listening to everyone.
I just want to make a quick comment. I love that comment and I agree with it, but I'm wondering, is it mutually exclusive? Like it seems like all of the above. And, but I could be wrong. I just don't see how one idea in this case would exclude the other. It's a given. It's always a situation where the nonprofit builders are welcome and can buy land and build. So I'm not sure that one really impacts the other, except for every affordable housing counts, I guess is what my thinking is. Councillor Panamarev?
Yeah, I was glad to hear Councilor Bastidas, because that's what I had actually raised my hand to say in the context of, we talk about, let's talk to an economist so they can tell us how the for-profit developers think and how to reach them. And I'm wondering, maybe we should spend our time talking to the nonprofit developers or the mission-driven developers and find out what kind of zoning and code would work for them. So that would be my suggestion, rather than talking to an economist as far as research goes.
Councillor Bricolo, and then Commissioner Bricolo, and then Councillor Clark.
And I'm not sure how the nonprofit scene works 100%, but is there a reason? I mean, like I assume it's like a profit thing, or maybe a purchasing power like initially, but is there a way to incentivize or give a leg up to the nonprofit developers as opposed to regular developers, commercial?
I mean, I would say that's what legislation like SB 8 does, right? It allows those nonprofit developers to buy properties that market rate developers can't develop for housing. So there are some precedents and for how those projects can be treated differently.
Yeah, and that's an appreciation for Councillor Pastizzo's point, which is, as we're talking about all of this and coming up with good ideas for inclusionary zoning or other tools, but also to add some energy into what can we do to also incentivize the nonprofits more than we already do. I think I saw Councillor Clark's hand go up and then Jordan's hand.
I had one more, sorry, just to tack onto that if I could, Mayor. Oh gosh, I might have lost it. I'm sorry, come back. Sorry, it escaped.
Yeah, my apologies if I derailed you. Put your hand up and I will come back to you. Councillor Clark.
Yeah, I would absolutely support an inclusionary zoning policy citywide, but that state level limit of developments of 20 or more is, as we all have talked about, is going to be of limited application. And I wish that limitation wasn't. I think it would be more useful if that limitation wasn't there. But as far as trying to incentivize affordability in commercial zones, I like the formula of you can build a greater percentage of residential so long as some certain percentage is affordable or workforce, and exactly what are the perfect numbers is a little bit of a guessing game. But to me, that makes sense because the residential is more valuable to include that as a part of the development, and we can get some community benefit for that by requiring the affordability component. And yeah, just gotta nail down exactly what are the right numbers to stick in there in my mind.
Okay, I saw Jordan's hand go up and then I saw, okay, so Councillor Panamarev and then Commissioner Hazel.
Thanks. It's really just a clarifying question. So I guess for residential, if we want to enforce affordable housing, we're talking IZ, inclusionary zoning, but this commercial stuff, we're not talking IZ, and we're not facing the state limitation of 20. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I looked to the statewide IZ, simply because they've spent a lot more time developing that policy than I, personally don't have my, development economic hat on. But no, it's a model that we're drawing from, but it does not legislatively apply to the commercial zones. You're free to deviate. Or refine, let's use that word.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it, we could be more restrictive, but not less restrictive, right? I mean, restrictive might be the wrong choice of words.
I would say we don't necessarily have to think in those terms for this application. Because again, this is really outside the bounds of the state's inclusionary zoning legislation. The city could require, could exceed the 20, they could go under 20, they could go over 20 units. In the statewide legislation, it's only up to 20% units can be required to be affordable, but that limit doesn't necessarily apply to the city, in this application. But I would just, I know we've been sort of discussing two different things, and just as a clarification, there's, this application of what the program for affordable units looks like in commercial zones now. And then, it certainly would be, to your advantage to think longer term about what you do with those lands as they come into the city's urban growth boundary and then into the city limits. And if there's an inclusionary zoning program that applies to those residential lands, but just there are two pretty different programs. And just the first is before us tonight to consider.
Good point. Commissioner Hazel.
My suggestion for talking to an economist at the time was definitely talking about seeing how it pencils out for builders. However, we also have to remember that we can't just have affordable housing. I mean, we have to have a tax base too. So I think the inclusionary zoning is where we have to remain or be strong. We have to have it all. We can't just have affordable housing. We have to have the housing that's going to keep paying for our infrastructure and our SDCs. And that's something that I think might get lost in this conversation sometimes. And I'm just putting that out there just as a reminder, because obviously the most important thing right now is affordable housing, and we've got to figure out how we can get a foothold. But I just don't want to lose sight of that. That's it.
Can I ask a clarifying question before I go to Commissioner Buchlow? Are you talking, when you say affordable housing and tax base, are you talking about the type of housing that doesn't pay taxes?
I'm talking about it, well, not just tax based, but waiving the fees, our enticements, what we're thinking of offering builders in exchange for creating affordable housing. We have to keep in mind what the ultimate, how this is going to pencil out for the city also.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Councilor Buchlow?
That was actually almost exactly what I was going to ask. So.
Did you, okay. And then Elizabeth?
Oh, sure. I just wanted to offer a clarification on that, is that I absolutely think that these different financial incentives should be part of developing this final policy. But just to be clear, we heard a lot from Ashland about their SDCs, but right now there is no proposal to go along with these code updates of whether it would be Sdc waivers or other financial incentives that the city might offer along with these affordable units to make this affordable residential and commercials more enticing. So just to say that, understood the questions and concerns from different members here tonight, but that none of those are sort of baked into the proposal at this point, and we'd want more guidance from you all before selecting which of those incentives we might include.
Okay, so that's a great way to segue into maybe just sort of honing in on direction. Forgive me, everyone, I'm sort of the one that got us into the weeds about urban reserves and all kinds of fun stuff. What we are talking about, though, is what's in front of us tonight. the staff and Elizabeth need a little further direction on. So does anybody have any comments on refining or anything else they'd like to see? Or to Elizabeth or Kristen or Jordan, is there anything you feel particularly strong about getting some guidance on? Might be also a good way to go about this conversation. So Councilor Panama, if you had your hand up and down. So
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Kristen
Okay.
and Jordan and Elizabeth first.
Great. Kristen?
I just wanted to make sure that this is that we all understand this is a first shot at our affordable housing component. It is strictly for commercial zoning. So keep that in mind, that this is not necessarily a trial, but it is for our commercial commercial and residential zoning. And also, just so you all know, we have in our residential zones, we have a few affordable housing projects that are being proposed. So it's not completely off the board for talent at this time. We have over 100 units being proposed in affordable housing. And we are discussing, Jordan and I are discussing SDCs and how that's going to look in our CETs and applying waiving CETs. Jordan and I were discussing today, and she mentioned that we have our CETs have been active since 2019, and we have less than $20,000 in that account. So we just have to really be mindful of how we're developing and what incentives we're going to be offered, what we can afford to offer. And I think that's what Jordan and I and council and planning commission, we could all, get together and discuss. But I'd like to, because we have proposals and requests for waivers of SDCs right now, we need to really hone in on what that's going to look like for the city. That's all I have right now.
Elizabeth?
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, and just sort of in terms of feedback that we're looking for tonight, I think that there's sort of the big picture question of like, yes, is this the direction that you are interested to go in? And is it worthwhile to continue refining this code? And if so, what are those refinements you'd like to see before bringing it forward for adoption? So both sort of big picture as well as detailed feedback that we're looking for tonight. But it being a work session, this is an initial discussion draft. It is not, up for public hearing or for consideration of adoption as drafted. So there's a lot of flexibility and room to go, but we would like to hear, are we headed in the right direction? Should we continue developing this, or is there a totally different set of policy options that you'd like to refocus us on, or other code areas to work on?
Sounds great. Okay, so what I think I'll do is take these next two questions, and then I will look for a consensus on that big picture question and see if there's any further agreements that we want to make tonight. So Councilor Panamariff, then Commissioner Bugelow, and then Councilor Clark. Councilor Panamariff?
Yeah, I'm thinking that as far as the direction and the refinement goes, we're kind of united in that what we're looking for is a sweet spot in terms of how to create affordable housing as much as we can, and workforce housing and all of that. And I'm wondering if whether it would be worth waiting a little bit to first see how the things that are in the air kind of pan out, to see what happens with the LCDC and ODOT are going to be doing this revisioning study and getting a lot of input from the community as far as what the community wants to see in the burn scar. I think we're considering doing another housing needs analysis. I'm just wondering whether the thing to do is to wait a little bit and to see what data comes to us in the next few months before we talk about refinement and all of that. But that, maybe we need to move right away. I'm not married to that, but I'm just wondering what other people think.
Thank you, Councilor Penamriff. Commissioner Bucalo?
Yeah, as far as big picture, I do like the direction. There was a clarifying question earlier that really helped me. I kept thinking the 20 unit thing applied to everything, and the clarification that it is not for the business. I like that. I'd like to look, maybe since we're not married to that or bound by that, maybe looking at percentages and just maybe figuring out, when it comes to rounding, we round and have some sort of convention written in that for that. But I would like to move forward with this. I like the formula. I like the incentive so far for at least the commercial.
Councilor Clark?
Yeah, I realized I had a little lack of clarity on how the proposed language overlays on the existing allowed uses. And I'm looking at this point for both CBD and CBH allows, wait, do I have it for both? No, well, let's see. I'm looking at CBD right here, and it says up to 1 ground floor residential use, provided it does not occupy more than 50% of the ground floor building area and is located behind. 1 residential use, that is like 1 unit? Is that what that means?
Oh, yes, that should say 1 unit. Apologies.
Okay. And then commercial business highway says ground floor residential for up to 50% of the gross site area. So that's no limit on the number of units, right?
Correct. And that's what's existing in the code.
And so when you talk about, 5%, if you're going to do 5% affordability, you can build 25% of the zone as residential, but they can already build 50% of the zone residential with no affordability requirement, right?
Correct. And so as I mentioned, those standards are really similar for the different zones, but the CBH, for precisely the reasons you're mentioning, those 2 lower tiers for the 25% and 50% there's no affordability requirement.
Oh, there we go.
Because it's already permitted. Now, that is something that you could provide direction that you'd like to change, that you would like to add in an affordability component for that first 50%. But in the interest of sort of policy neutrality and, keeping people whole with what development rights they already have, it's proposed to maintain the existing use.
Okay, thanks. That I'm clearer on that now.
Great.
Okay, so I guess what I will ask, if there's anybody that really objects to the direction that we're going in, would like to see us go in a different direction with this, raise your hand. Councilor Clark?
I like the direction it's going. I feel like the most prominent question is, what is the minimum number of units that this would apply to, if any, and what are the consequences of setting it where you set it? And but I feel like that's the most prominent question, and I would initially propose it as significantly less than 20.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is I'm taking a consensus on the direction that we're going in, and then we'll drill down on some agreements for refinement. So I didn't see anybody raise their hand in objection to the direction we're going in. So I'm going to call that a consensus, and I hope that answers the first question, Elizabeth. And then, are you looking for numbers tonight? And I think there was like 3 questions that you asked earlier, Elizabeth. Let's address those first. So we got the big high level question. What is the other one you want to get tonight?
Well, I think it's less, are there different numbers that you would like to see? I mean, we could, if there are strong feelings about numbers, we could work on that, but I also wouldn't expect anyone, to have developed and researched a proposal on those. It's more about identifying which areas in the code you would like to see further revision and or research to support. So what I've heard clearly tonight is that revisiting that applicability threshold of 20 units or more, that you'd like to see some more options on what that threshold might be. And so along those lines, just, again, if there are opinions about what that number could be, happy to hear them now, but more interested in like which specific code aspects you'd like to see further work and refinement on to bring the next draft forward.
So that will be the question I will ask after taking Councilor Penamara's comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question. One of the problems we have is that people sitting on land for a long time. And you just mentioned, is there other areas the codes do we want to look at? Would it be out of scope to look at changes to the code that would disincentivize people from sitting on land and not developing it? Or is that totally out of scope?
I'd say that's pretty distinct from what we're doing in the zoning code, and that would probably be more of a tax policy kind of question that you'd want to look at.
So if I understand the question that you're looking for, Elizabeth, is currently we're looking at like basically the commercial zones, and are there any other zones outside of the commercial zones that we want to consider?
No,
or
I'm sorry.
Only within the commercial zones?
Within the proposed draft code, are there specific standards that are being proposed in the draft that just, aren't landing quite right, or that you feel where you'd like to see additional work? So again, like that 20 unit threshold, maybe some of these, we heard some discussion, could there be a mix of the workforce and affordable units? Yes, that's something that can be resolved with the footnote about, how those can be combined. We could add some language. I've heard maybe about how the rounding works. If you have less than a full unit, do you round up or round down? But those kinds of refinement of the proposed standards, not other sections of the code.
So I'm hearing it, and actually hearing it from Kristen as well, that you both have kind of a general idea of the direction that we want to go in based on some of the conversation. Like you've gotten some ideas out of tonight's conversation. So are there any other ideas from any of the councilors or commissions that they'd like to add to that understanding at this time? And if not, I would say, unless somebody sees it differently, is there anybody that objects to the kind of the echoing of some of the conversations we had and having them take that and bring that back as part of some of the refinements or revisions? Like it sounded right to me. Councilor Penamara?
Yeah, and I would just like to see, more of the housing be workforce or affordable. That's all.
I mean, are you saying less workforce, more?
Well, I mean,
affordable?
no, I'm saying, there's a percentage that's just market rate, and the other is going to be either workforce or affordable or something. What I was hinting at, before with the idea of just, crunching numbers was a kind of like a scoring of the project as a whole in terms of affordability. And it could be like a lot at 80% or half at 60% or a small portion at 20, something like that. But if that's too complicated and not clear and objective, what I'd like to see is just more leaning towards a greater percentage be not market rate, be that either something AMI.
Mm-hmm. Does that give you both something to work with on that thought? Okay, Councilor Clark?
Yeah, I like to echo what Councilor Penamara suggested, and you know, the right side of the table, which is the maximum percent of the gross site area allowed as ground floor residential, 25, 50, 75, 100. That's a perfect, a very sensible way to approach it. The left side of the table, and what are the corollaries to that? I'm looking at and just wondering, is 5% enough to get your foot in the door? And that maybe those percentages should be higher, especially on the low end.
Thanks.
And I guess to my earlier point, is I hope that whatever we're doing today would be able to be carried over into other areas of our code, so that when we are looking at the long range picture and looking outside of what we have in the immediate, that we'll be able to easily, transfer what we do here into other areas of our code and other zoning.
Right, absolutely. I mean, looking forward and getting policies on the books and identifying some targets makes a lot of sense, and setting this program up in ways that we define things and measure things in ways that can be carried forward makes a lot of sense.
All right, is there anything else? And do we need to do anything for you, Kristen, or you, Elizabeth, or do you have everything you need at this time?
No, I appreciate the discussion and all the questions and ideas that you've shared tonight. Thank you all.
Yeah, I echo Elizabeth. Yeah, it's been great. Got some good direction.
Great. Well, thank you for bringing this back to us. This is some of the best response we've had around this topic in a very, very long time. And I speak for, I think, most of us, or if not all of us, that we're really grateful that you guys are really leaning into this work. So with that, let me take a quick look at the agenda and see if there's anything else on there. Oh, yeah, by golly. Is there anybody from the attendees that wish to speak on this item, or were there any speakers on request forms on this? Did we lose Hector earlier? Probably when I started talking about urban reserves.
Mayor, I'm not aware of any, I spoke with Hector earlier and I'm not aware of any requests to speak.
Okay. And nobody's in the attendees, so we'll go ahead and adjourn this meeting at 8.
We have 3 attendees.
Yeah, there's nobody raising their hand in the attendees. So with that, I think we'll adjourn this meeting at 7:59. Thanks, everybody. 2 hours on your Tuesday night. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. All right, great. Thank you, team. Nice work tonight.